What if the moment you thought would save you is the moment everything went quiet instead? Not loud, not dramatic, no lightning bolt, just a strange internal click, like a switch flipped behind your eyes, and suddenly the world felt thinner. Because no one warns you about this part of awakening. They sell you fireworks but forget to mention the silence that comes after. The kind of silence that doesn't feel peaceful at first. It feels empty, disorienting, almost like grief. And if you're here right now listening to this, there's a good chance you know exactly what I'm talking about. Maybe you had a breakthrough, a realization, a collapse, a dark night. Maybe your old identity cracked open, and for a moment you felt free, expansive, awake. And then days or weeks later you noticed something unsettling. Your drive faded, your urgency disappeared. The goals that once kept you moving suddenly felt irrelevant, not wrong, just hollow. And the question crept in quietly, almost shyly. Why do I feel numb now that I finally see? This is the paradox no one puts on the cover of spiritual books. Awakening doesn't always light you up. Sometimes it drains the color out of things before it gives you a new palette. And that can be terrifying if you don't know what's happening. Because from the outside, it looks like you're losing motivation, losing ambition, losing yourself. But internally, something much deeper is unfolding. Something ancient, something psychological, something Carl Jung understood long before enlightenment became a hashtag. And here's the truth most people never hear. You didn't become empty because awakening failed. You became empty because something false finished dissolving. And emptiness is not the end. It's the space where something real can finally emerge. But before we go any further, let me ask you this, and I want you to answer honestly in the comments, because you're not the only one wondering this. Have you noticed that after waking up, you stopped wanting what you used to want? Not out of sadness, but out of a quiet indifference? Drop a yes or explain what changed for you below. Your words might help someone else feel less alone. Now, Jung never talked about awakening the way modern spirituality does. He didn't promise bliss. He warned of disorientation. He believed that when unconscious material rises into awareness, it doesn't arrive neatly packaged. It disrupts your entire motivational system. The ego, the part of you that chased success, approval, validation, loses its steering wheel. And without that familiar hunger, life can feel strangely pointless for a while. Not depressing in a clinical sense, just flat, muted, like the music got turned down but you don't know who has the volume knob anymore. And this is where people panic. They assume something went wrong. They try to force themselves back into productivity, back into passion, back into high vibration living, as if slapping affirmations on a psychological rebirth is going to speed it up. But Jung would say the opposite. He would say this pause is not a mistake, it's a rite of passage, a necessary psychological winter where the old structures die so something truer can be born. And winter is not lazy, winter is strategic. It conserves energy while transformation happens underground. Think about it. Your previous motivation was fueled by identity, by the story of who you thought you were supposed to be, what you were supposed to achieve, who you were supposed to impress. And when awakening strips that story bare, the fuel disappears. Not because you're broken, but because that engine no longer fits the vehicle you're becoming. So of course you feel stalled. You're trying to run a new operating system on old software. Jung called this moment the collapse of the persona, the mask you wore to survive and succeed in the world. And when that mask falls away, there's a gap, a void, a strange in-between where the ego no longer leads, but the self hasn't fully stepped forward yet. And this is where so many people get stuck, judging themselves, diagnosing themselves, shaming themselves for not being on fire anymore. But hear this clearly, stillness is not stagnation, silence is not failure, And numbness is often the psyche's way of protecting you while it rewires something fundamental. And before we continue, if this is resonating and you've ever felt unseen in this phase, take a second and gently tap the like button, not for the algorithm, but as a quiet signal to yourself that you're allowed to be where you are. Because what comes next might completely change how you see this fog you're walking through. Here's where it gets even more interesting, because what you're experiencing isn't new, it's ancient. Cultures across history recognized this strange post-awakening void as a sacred threshold, the desert, the wilderness, the cocoon phase. But our modern world has no patience for it. We pathologize it, label it, rush it, medicate it, or drown it in distractions. And Jung warned that doing so robs the soul of its most important transformation. Because when the ego steps back, the unconscious finally has room to speak. And the unconscious doesn't shout, it whispers. It sends symbols, dreams, emotions, sensations. And when you're constantly forcing yourself to get motivated, you miss the message. Jung believed that this loss of drive is not depression, but reorientation. Your psyche is recalibrating away from fear-based motivation toward something more aligned, more authentic, more whole. But that recalibration feels like nothingness before it feels like direction, and that's the part no one wants to sit with. So let me ask you something. And again, I want you to answer this in the comments because it sparks real discussion. Do you feel like your old goals stopped making sense, but you don't yet know what should replace them? Write what no longer fits in your life, even if you can't name what's next. Jung described this phase as a psychological death, not of the body, but of the identity. And death is never comfortable. It's disorienting, quiet, humbling, and strangely sacred. The ego wants clarity, timelines, plans, but the self operates on a different rhythm. It unfolds when the conditions are right, not when your anxiety demands answers. This is why forcing purpose during this phase often backfires. You end up chasing things that look meaningful but feel empty because they're still rooted in the old identity. And Jung warned that if you stop here, if you cling to detachment and call it enlightenment, you fall into spiritual bypassing, convincing yourself that nothing matters, that life is an illusion, so why engage at all? But that's not awakening. That's avoidance dressed up as wisdom. The self does not reject the world. It wants to be expressed through it, embodied in it, lived. And this is where the void becomes sacred, because it strips away what was false without yet handing you the replacement, forcing you to listen instead of chase. Listen. And that listening can feel unbearable at first, especially in a culture addicted to noise and productivity. But Jung believed that meaning is not manufactured, it's discovered, and discovery requires space. And here's something crucial most people miss. Your lack of motivation right now might actually be intelligence at work. Your psyche refusing to pour energy into paths that no longer align, conserving life force for what's coming next, even if you can't see it yet. Think of it like this. A caterpillar doesn't mourn its legs when it enters the cocoon. It dissolves, literally turns into soup. And from the outside, it looks like nothing is happening. But internally, everything is happening. Structure is being dismantled. Instructions are being rewritten. And if someone were to shake the cocoon yelling, "Hurry up," they'd destroy the process, not speed it up. So if you've been judging yourself for being still, tired, unmotivated, consider this. What if your soul asked for rest because it's doing something far more complex than hustling? And before we move forward, if you're finding value here, let me gently invite you to support the channel by subscribing, because this space exists for conversations most people never have out loud, and your presence here matters more than you know. Now, the real shift begins when you stop fighting the void and start cooperating with it. Not romanticizing it, not wallowing in it, but respecting it as a phase with a purpose. And that cooperation starts with curiosity instead of judgment. Asking different questions, not "what's wrong with me?" but "what is being asked of me now?" And I'm curious, what question has been haunting you during this phase? Share it below, because naming it is the first step towards transformation. As you linger in this space, something subtle begins to change. Not dramatically, not all at once, but quietly, like a low-frequency hum returning beneath the silence. And this is where Jung's work becomes especially powerful, because he understood that the next phase isn't about regaining old motivation, it's about developing a new relationship with energy itself. Motivation rooted not in fear or validation, but in alignment. And alignment feels different. It doesn't push, it pulls. It doesn't scream, it invites. And most people miss it because they're waiting for fireworks instead of noticing the whisper. Jung called this the emergence of the self, not the ego self, but the deeper organizing center of the psyche, the part of you that knows where life is trying to go even when your mind doesn't. And when this self begins to lead, life becomes symbolic, meaningful in ordinary ways. You start noticing patterns, synchronicities, repeated themes in your interests and dreams. And this is how direction returns, not as a 5-year plan, but as a series of honest steps. And here's where I want to slow this down because it matters. The self does not care about looking impressive, it cares about being true. So the motivation it offers will not feel like hustle culture energy. It will feel quieter, steadier, sometimes even inconvenient, because it may ask you to let go of things that look good on paper but feel wrong in your body, and say yes to things that don't come with applause. And that can be scary, because it means trusting an inner compass instead of external validation. So let me ask you this, and I really want you to reflect before answering in the comments. When was the last time you felt drawn to something for no logical reason? Not because it paid well or impressed anyone, but because it felt alive inside you. Share that moment below, even if you ignored it at the time. Jung believed that ignoring these signals leads to stagnation, while honoring them, even in small ways, restores vitality. And vitality is the truest sign of psychological health. Not constant happiness, not endless motivation, but a sense that your energy is moving in the right direction, even if slowly. And this is where many people misunderstand the return of motivation. It doesn't come back as intensity, it comes back as integrity, a quiet willingness to engage with life honestly, without pretending, without performing. And when you begin living this way, something surprising happens. Action becomes easier, not because you're forcing yourself, but because you're no longer fighting yourself. This is why people who integrate this phase often say they feel more productive with less effort, because they're not leaking energy into things that don't fit. Jung called this living in accordance with the self, and he believed it was the goal of individuation, not perfection, not enlightenment, but wholeness, the ability to hold light and shadow, action and rest, meaning and mystery without collapsing into extremes. And here's an important warning Jung gave that still applies today. If you rush to define your new purpose too quickly, you risk rebuilding another persona, another mask, spiritual this time, and the cycle repeats. Burnout follows, disillusionment returns. So patience here is not optional, it's essential. And patience doesn't mean doing nothing forever. It means acting when something feels resonant rather than reactive. Before we continue, if you're finding yourself nodding along, do me a favor and hit the like button. It helps this message reach others who are silently struggling with the same phase, and more importantly, it anchors this insight in your own nervous system. Now, the question isn't, how do I get motivated again? The real question is, what kind of life is trying to emerge through me now? And that answer doesn't arrive in one sentence. It unfolds through experience, experimentation, and yes, sometimes mistakes. But mistakes guided by truth feel different than mistakes driven by fear. They teach instead of drain. So as we move forward, stay with this, because the final shift isn't about escaping the void, it's about integrating it, carrying its wisdom into a life that finally feels like yours. At some point, you realize the fog didn't steal your spark. It burned away the noise that was masking it. And this realization doesn't arrive as relief, it arrives as responsibility. Because now you can no longer unsee what doesn't fit. You can't unknow what your body and soul are saying no to. And that's where the real work begins. Jung believed that consciousness comes with a price. Once you see, you're accountable to what you see. And many people try to numb themselves here, scrolling, consuming, chasing distraction, because living consciously means making choices that are sometimes uncomfortable, even lonely. But it's also where life starts to feel real again, textured, grounded, alive. And motivation returns not as pressure, but as participation. You begin to participate with life instead of trying to dominate it. And that shift changes everything. The way you work, the way you relate, the way you rest. Jung referred to this as the symbolic life, where your actions are infused with meaning not because they're grand, but because they're aligned. Washing dishes can feel meaningful if it's honest. Creating art can feel empty if it's performative. And that's a radical redefinition of success most people never make. So let me ask you another question. And again, I invite you to answer in the comments because this builds collective insight. Where in your life are you still doing things out of habit or expectation rather than truth? Name one area you feel misaligned, even slightly. Awareness is the first step to integration, and integration is the real goal, not transcendence. Jung never wanted people to escape their humanity. He wanted them to inhabit it fully, shadows and all. And this phase you're in, the so-called loss of motivation, is often the gateway to that embodiment, because it strips away compulsive doing and replaces it with conscious choice. And conscious choice is slower, heavier, but infinitely more powerful. You may notice you start saying no more often, not aggressively, just calmly. You stop explaining yourself as much. You stop chasing closure. You stop forcing enthusiasm. And while that might look like withdrawal to others, internally it feels like relief, like finally putting down a weight you didn't realize you were carrying. And here's something important to understand. This doesn't mean life becomes easy or blissful. Jung was clear about that. Suffering doesn't disappear, it transforms. It becomes meaningful suffering, suffering that refines rather than depletes. And that's the kind of suffering that produces wisdom, depth, compassion, not bitterness. And this is where your energy stabilizes, because it's no longer tied to outcomes, it's tied to values. And values don't fluctuate with external praise or failure. So if you've been waiting to feel ready before engaging with life again, consider this. Readiness is not a feeling, it's a relationship with uncertainty, with your inner signals, with the unfolding process itself. And readiness grows as you respond honestly to what's in front of you, not as you wait for clarity to arrive fully formed. Before we move into the final part, I want to pause and ask for your support. If this conversation feels meaningful, consider subscribing to the channel. It helps sustain these deeper explorations, and more importantly, it connects you with a community that understands this path isn't linear or flashy, it's real. And now, as we approach the heart of this journey, remember this: the goal was never to get your old motivation back. The goal was to become someone who no longer needs to betray themselves to move forward. And that is a far greater achievement than any checklist could ever offer. Eventually, you notice that action starts happening again, not in bursts of manic productivity, but in quiet consistency. You wake up and do the thing that feels right that day, not because you should, but because something in you says yes. And this yes feels calm, grounded, undeniable. Jung would say this is the ego learning to serve the self instead of ruling it. And when that relationship shifts, life regains momentum without anxiety. You may still feel tired sometimes, confused sometimes, even lost on certain days. But underneath it all, there's a subtle trust, a sense that you're no longer walking against yourself. And that trust is the true return of motivation. Not excitement, not urgency, but trust. And here's where many people realize the irony. The life that emerges from this place is often more impactful than the one driven by ego ever was, because it's sustainable. It doesn't burn you out. It doesn't require constant validation. It flows from alignment. Jung believed that when the self leads, creativity becomes service, work becomes expression, and effort becomes devotion. Not devotion to an outcome, but devotion to truth. And that truth expresses itself uniquely through each person. So your path will not look like anyone else's, and that's not a flaw. That's the point. Individuation literally means becoming an individual, not a copy, not a role, not an archetype borrowed from someone else's story. Let me ask you one final reflective question here, and I encourage you to answer this thoughtfully in the comments. If you stopped trying to impress anyone, including your past self, what would you feel called to build, explore, or express? Even if it scares you, even if it feels small. That question doesn't demand an immediate answer. It's a seed, and seeds take time, but they grow when tended with honesty. And honesty is the currency of this phase. Not motivation hacks, not productivity systems. Honesty. And that honesty might lead you to change careers, or simplify your life, or deepen a relationship, or create something quietly without an audience. All of it counts if it's true. And this is where the fog lifts, not all at once, but enough for you to see the next step. And the next step is all you ever need. Jung warned against trying to see the whole path. He believed that life unfolds symbolically, step by step, moment by moment, and clarity follows action, not the other way around. So if you're still in that in-between space, still feeling unmotivated, still questioning everything, let this be your reassurance. You're not late, you're not broken, you're not failing, you're in transition. And transitions feel like nothing before they feel like something, but something is forming, even now. Before we close, if this video resonated, I'd love for you to like it and share your thoughts below. Not because engagement metrics matter more than meaning, but because conversation creates mirrors, and mirrors help us see ourselves more clearly. And you never know who might read your comment and feel understood for the first time. This path isn't about escaping the world. It's about inhabiting it with your whole self, and that takes courage, patience, and a willingness to walk through silence without panicking. And if you're doing that, you're already further along than you think. So here you are, standing at the edge of who you used to be and who you're becoming. And it's quiet. Not because nothing is happening, but because something sacred is rearranging itself beneath the surface. Jung never promised comfort, he promised meaning. And meaning is born when we stop running from ourselves and start listening, really listening, to what life is asking of us now. Not 5 years ago, not before the awakening, now. This isn't the end of your story. It's the moment the story becomes yours, not inherited, not performed, not forced. And if you've stayed with this video until this point, that tells me something about you. You're not looking for shortcuts, you're looking for truth. And truth unfolds slowly, but it stays, it roots, it holds you when motivation fluctuates. Remember, the old fire burned fast and demanded constant fuel. The new flame is steadier, quieter, and it doesn't go out when the winds change. It warms instead of consumes. And that's the fire awakening was always meant to reveal. Not ecstasy, but integrity. Not endless drive, but aligned movement. Not escape, but embodiment. If this message spoke to you, I invite you one last time to share your experience in the comments. What part of this phase are you in right now? The fog, the void, the quiet pull, or the first steps back into action? Your voice matters here, and this space grows stronger when we speak honestly. And if you want to continue exploring these deeper layers of psychology, soul, and self-understanding, consider subscribing to Fractal Wisdom. Because awakening isn't about leaving life behind, it's about finally living it from the inside out. Thank you for being here, for listening, for walking this strange and beautiful path. And remember, the silence you're in now is not empty, it's pregnant with becoming. And that becoming is already underway.